Marcus walked into the kitchen, his silk tie perfectly knotted, the silence around him heavy and thick like the humid air before a storm. He smirked at the sight of the blueberry pancakes, his eyes gleaming with the sick satisfaction that I had finally accepted my role as his obedient doll. Waiting on him hand and foot, I poured the dark roast coffee with a steady hand, letting the rich aroma mask the bile rising in my throat. My face a mask of porcelain calm that I had perfected over years of hidden terror. His smile vanished instantly, replaced by a pale mask of terror, when my mother, who was supposed to be in Florida, stepped out from the shadows of the pantry with a trembling hand. In that frozen moment, as the coffee pot hovered over his expensive china cup, he realized that my silence wasn't submission, but a carefully constructed cage that had just snapped shut. You know, that specific kind of silence, the one that screams louder than any shattering glass, clinging to the walls of a house that looks too perfect to be real. Imagine a kitchen bathed in the soft, golden light of an American morning, where the smell of sizzling bacon fights a losing battle against the cold stench of fear. For 5 years, I have been the curator of this twisted museum, polishing the silverware and hiding the bruises on my soul, just to keep the peace for a mother who had already lost too much. I became a ghost in my own home, a shadow gliding across the marble floors, convincing myself that if I just made myself small enough, the monster wouldn't see me. But monsters, you see, they don't hunt for food, they hunt for fear. And my stepfather, Marcus, had been feeding on mine until there was nothing left but a hollow shell. People see him as a saint, a philanthropist who saves orphans and donates to the church, but they don't see the way he looks at me when the doors are closed, or the cameras he planted where I'm most vulnerable. I thought I could endure it forever. I thought silence was my shield, until last night, when the shield cracked, and I realized that to save us both, I had to become the thing he feared most, a woman who has absolutely nothing left to lose. The morning sun filtered through the high windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, creating a deceptive scene of domestic tranquility that felt more like a stage set than a home. Marcus adjusted his cufflinks, the gold catching the light, a small gesture of vanity that made my stomach turn, knowing those hands had touched things they never should have. He picked up the morning paper, the crisp sound of the pages turning echoing in the room, acting as if the war inside my head wasn't happening, as if he hadn't destroyed my world just 10 hours ago. I watched him from the counter, my fingers gripping the edge of the granite so hard that my knuckles turned white, grounding myself in the physical pain to keep from screaming. He looked at the pancakes, fluffy and covered in syrup just the way he liked them, and offered me a nod, a benevolent king acknowledging his servant, completely unaware that every blueberry was a bullet I was saving for later. The domesticity of it all was the cruelest joke, the way evil wraps itself in the mundane, hiding behind freshly brewed coffee and starched shirts, making you question your own sanity, making you wonder if the nightmare is actually real. I took a breath, a long, shaky inhale that filled my lungs with the scent of butter and betrayal, and forced my legs to move, carrying the coffee pot toward the table, toward the man who had turned my sanctuary into a prison. My mind, however, was not in this sunlit kitchen, but drifting back to the suffocating darkness of last night, dragging me back to the moment the ground beneath me crumbled. It had started innocently enough, with a knock on my bedroom door, a sound that usually signaled a request for help with his computer or a question about dinner, but when he entered, he didn't stop at the threshold. He kept walking, invading the personal space I had tried so desperately to fortify, his presence filling the room with a suffocating cologne. He held a tablet in his hand, the screen glowing with a blue light that cast eerie shadows on his face, twisting his handsome features into something grotesque and predatory. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't need to, because the power he held wasn't physical. It was the absolute destruction of my privacy, the annihilation of my dignity. He turned the screen toward me, and my heart stopped, literally skipped a beat, and then hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. As I saw myself on the screen, it was me, in my bathroom, unaware and vulnerable, the grain of the hidden camera capturing every moment I thought was private, every moment I thought I was safe. The realization hit me like a physical blow, a wave of nausea so intense I had to grab the bedpost to keep from collapsing, my mind racing to understand how, where, and for how long he had been watching. "You have grown into such a beautiful woman, Clara," he had whispered, his voice smooth like velvet over gravel, a tone that made my skin crawl with 1,000 invisible insects. He swiped a finger across the screen, changing the angle, showing another view, this time from a camera hidden in the smoke detector above my bed, capturing my restless sleep. "I capture beauty. That's all I do. I am an admirer of art, and you are the finest piece in my collection," he said, stepping closer until I could smell the scotch on his breath. I backed away until my spine hit the cold wall, my hands trembling, my voice trapped in my throat, unable to form the words to beg or scream. He smiled, that charming smile that won him awards and handshakes from the mayor, and dropped the bomb that would shatter my life. "Tomorrow night, I'm hosting a private viewing for some very special friends online, and I want you to be the star. Live." The ultimatum hung in the air, heavy and toxic. A choice that wasn't a choice at all comply with his sick fantasy. Or he would release the footage he already had to everyone I knew, to my university, to the world. He leaned in, brushing a stray hair from my face, his touch burning like acid, and whispered, "Be a good girl, Clara. Don't make me ruin your future, because we both know no one will believe the crazy stepdaughter over the respectable Marcus Thorne." He left the room then, closing the door softly, leaving me in the darkness with the echo of his threat bouncing around my skull, paralyzing me with a fear so deep it felt like drowning. I didn't sleep. I couldn't sleep. Instead, I sat on the floor, hugging my knees, rocking back and forth as the hours ticked by, measuring the time I had left before my soul was sold. I thought about running, packing a bag and disappearing into the night, becoming a statistic, a runaway, anything to escape the lens of his cameras. But then I looked at the photo of my mother on the nightstand, her smile tired but genuine, the woman who had worked double shifts to buy me braces, who thought she had finally found happiness with a good man. If I ran, he would destroy her. He would twist the narrative. He would break her heart and leave her with nothing but debt and shame. And I couldn't let that happen. The tears I wanted to shed never came. They were replaced by a cold, hard resolve, a crystallization of hatred that formed in the pit of my stomach. I stood up, my legs stiff, and walked to the window, watching the first gray light of dawn creep over the horizon, signaling the start of the day he thought he had won. I realized then that I wasn't a victim anymore. I was a witness, and he had made the fatal mistake of underestimating the quiet girl who played the piano and baked cookies. Back in the kitchen, the coffee poured into the cup in a dark, steady stream, the steam rising up to meet my face, grounding me in the present moment, the moment of execution. Marcus reached for the syrup, his movements relaxed, entitled, "The Absolute Picture of a Man Who Believes He is Untouchable, a Man Who Believes He Owns the World and Everyone in It." "You know," he said, slicing into the stack of pancakes, "I was thinking we could redecorate your room next week. Maybe something more mature, something that suits the woman you're becoming." The double meaning in his words was a razor blade wrapped in silk, a reminder of his intrusion, a reminder that he thought he had broken me. I didn't answer. I couldn't trust my voice not to shake, so I just placed the coffee pot back on the warmer, the click of the glass against the metal sounding like a gavel striking a block. I looked at the clock on the microwave. the numbers glowing green 7:05 a.m. Exactly the time he liked to start his day, exactly the time the trap was set to spring. "Is your mother still sleeping?" he asked, not really caring, just making conversation to fill the air, assuming she was miles away in her blissful ignorance. "She's not sleeping. Marcus," I said, my voice sounding strange to my own ears, low and devoid of the fear he was expecting. "She's not even in Florida." His fork paused halfway to his mouth, a frown creasing his forehead, a flicker of confusion disrupting his arrogant calm, as if the script he had written in his head had suddenly changed. "What are you talking about, Clara?" he asked, a hint of irritation creeping into his tone, the tone of a master correcting a slow child. I stepped back, moving away from the table, creating a physical distance between us, my heart pounding a rhythm of war against my ribs. "I said," I repeated, louder this time, letting the anger I had suppressed for 5 years bleed into the words. "She is not in Florida." And then, as if on cue, the pantry door creaked open, a sound that seemed to shatter the silence into a million jagged pieces. My mother stepped out, still wearing her travel clothes, her face pale and streaked with dried tears, her hands clutching the iPad I had given her an hour ago. Marcus dropped his fork, the metal clattering loudly against the china, the noise echoing like a gunshot in the pristine kitchen. He stared at her, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, the color draining from his face as he saw the device in her hands, as he heard his own voice playing from the speaker, the recording of his threat from last night. The silence that followed was not the silence of submission. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a judgment day that had arrived too soon. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind him, sealing the room in a silence that felt less like peace and more like the pressurized quiet of a submarine deep underwater, leaving me standing on the carpet with my skin crawling as if 1,000 invisible spiders were skittering beneath the surface. I didn't scream. I didn't throw the vase that stood on the nightstand, because any noise would have been an admission of the fear he fed on. So instead, I rushed to the bathroom and turned the shower handle until it wouldn't go any further. The water was scalding, hot enough to turn my skin lobster red, but I stood under the spray for what felt like an eternity, scrubbing my arms, my chest, my legs, trying desperately to wash away the phantom sensation of his gaze, the sticky, invisible residue of his violation. I used the rough loofah until my skin stung, tears finally mixing with the steam. But deep down I knew that no amount of soap could cleanse the feeling of being a specimen in a jar, watched and analyzed by a man who called himself my father. The steam filled the small room, fogging up the mirror, and when I finally stepped out and wiped the glass, the face staring back at me wasn't the terrified girl he thought he had broken, but a stranger with hollow eyes and a jaw set in grim determination. I wrapped the towel tight around me, shivering not from cold, but from the adrenaline dumping into my system. And I knew with a terrifying clarity that I would not sleep tonight, because sleeping meant closing my eyes, and closing my eyes meant letting him win. I dressed in the dark, avoiding the spots where I suspected his electronic eyes were hidden, pulling on thick sweatpants and a baggy hoodie as if layers of cotton could serve as armor against digital intrusion. My room, once my sanctuary filled with posters and fairy lights, now felt like a stage set where every movement was a performance, every breath recorded for a perverse audience I couldn't see. I needed to move. I needed to occupy my hands to keep my mind from spiraling into the abyss of panic. So I began to clean. A manic, silent cleaning that was a desperate attempt to reclaim some order in a world that had spiraled into chaos. I organized my bookshelf, aligning the spines perfectly, folding my clothes with military precision, my movements jerky and mechanical, driven by a frantic energy that buzzed in my veins like too much caffeine. Every time I passed the smoke detector, the small red light blinked, a rhythmic pulse that felt like a mocking heartbeat. reminding me that privacy was a luxury I could no longer afford, a concept that had been stolen from me while I slept. I sat on the floor, surrounded by the perfectly folded laundry, and realized that this was his true power, not the physical threat, but the psychological siege, the way he made me question the sanctity of my own four walls. But in that darkness, amidst the fear, a small, cold spark of anger began to ignite, fueled by the injustice of it all, fueled by the realization that while I was cowering, he was probably sleeping soundly, confident in his absolute control. My eyes wandered to the digital photo frame on my desk, a gift from him last Christmas, scrolling through a curated slideshow of our happy family, images of vacations and birthdays that now looked like evidence of a long con rather than memories. But behind that digital lie, tucked away in the shadows of the bottom shelf, was a leather case, dusty and worn, smelling of old chemicals and nostalgia, a relic from a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. I reached out and pulled it closer, my fingers trembling as I unzipped the bag to reveal my biological father's old Nikon camera, a heavy, mechanical beast of metal and glass that had no Wi-Fi, no cloud storage, just honest mechanics and light. I held it to my chest, closing my eyes, and for a brief moment, the smell of the leather transported me back to a time before Marcus, before the mansion, before the suffocating debt that brought him into our lives. My father used to say that a camera is a tool for truth, that it freezes a moment so you can see what the naked eye misses. And sitting there in the dark, I realized the irony was sharp enough to draw blood. Marcus used cameras to distort, to control, to create a false narrative of a perfect daughter and a benevolent father, while hiding the rotting reality beneath the surface. I looked through the viewfinder, the prism dark without a battery, and whispered a silent apology to the man who gave it to me, promising him that I would use this legacy not to create art, but to expose a monster. Memory is a treacherous thing. It softens the edges of pain and makes you doubt your own instincts. And sitting there, I found myself remembering the Marcus of 5 years ago, the man who had charmed his way into our shattered lives with the precision of a surgeon. I remembered the day he taught me to ride my bike without training wheels, running alongside me down the suburban street, his hand steady on the seat, his voice cheering me on with a warmth that felt so genuine it made my chest ache. He wasn't a monster then, or maybe he was just a better actor, wearing the mask of a savior who had come to rescue two broken women from their grief and financial ruin. He had bought me books, paid for my piano lessons, and listened to my teenage ramblings with a patience that my own father, busy and often away, had rarely shown. It was a slow grooming, a meticulous process of building trust brick by brick, so that when he finally started to dismantle my boundaries, I was too confused, too grateful, and too dependent to recognize the demolition for what it was. I remembered the way he looked at my mother at their wedding, promising to protect us, to provide for us, a vow that now tasted like ash in my mouth, a lie told in a church before God and witnesses. That memory, that image of the benevolent protector, was the hardest thing to kill. But as I sat there gripping the cold metal of the Nikon, I strangled it, burying the good Marcus in the graveyard of my innocence. The shift happened around 300 a.m., the darkest hour of the night, when the house settled into a deep, groaning silence and the heating vents whispered secrets through the walls. I stopped crying, the tears drying on my cheeks into a tight, salty mask, and a strange, icy calm washed over me, a sensation of detachment that allowed me to think not as a victim, but as a strategist. If he was watching, I had to give him nothing. So I moved to the blind spot I had calculated earlier, a small corner near the closet where the angle of the smoke detector couldn't reach. I pulled out my phone, turning the brightness down to the lowest setting, and began to research, my thumbs flying across the screen, searching for hidden camera detection. Network scanning. Local server access. I wasn't a hacker, I was an art student. But fear is a powerful teacher, and hatred is an even better motivator. Sharpening my mind to a razor's edge, I downloaded a network scanner app, my heart pounding in my ears as the progress bar loaded, praying that his arrogance had made him sloppy, that he hadn't bothered to hide his tracks on the home Wi-Fi. And there it was, a list of connected devices, harmless names like living room TV and smart fridge. But hidden among them were strings of IP addresses with no names. Devices that were transmitting data even while the house slept. I stood up, my legs numb, and looked at the smoke detector again. Not with fear this time, but with the cold, analytical gaze of a hunter spotting prey, realizing that the technology he used to bind me was also the rope I would use to hang him. I crept out of my room, moving like a ghost through the hallway, avoiding the floorboards I knew would creak, my bare feet silent on the plush carpet that Marcus had paid for. The house was a tomb, the shadows stretching long and distorted, but I wasn't afraid of the dark anymore. I was part of it, a predator stalking through the undergrowth of my own home. I made my way to his study, the forbidden zone where we were never allowed to enter without permission, the door handle feeling cold and heavy in my hand. It wasn't locked. Why would it be? He was the king of this castle. And kings don't lock their doors against their subjects, especially subjects they believe are broken and cowed. Inside, the room smelled of expensive leather and stale scotch, a masculine scent that used to signal safety but now signaled danger, and the green light of his main server tower hummed in the corner like a sleeping beast. I approached his desk, my hands shaking not from fear but from the enormity of what I was about to do, knowing that crossing this line meant there was no going back, no return to the illusion of a happy family. I sat in his chair, the leather still warm from his body, a sensation that made my skin crawl, and woke up his computer, holding my breath as the password prompt appeared on the screen. I typed in the date of my mother's birthday, his go-to code for everything, a symbol of his possessiveness, and pressed enter, watching as the screen unlocked to reveal the folders, the files, the digital evidence of his perversion. The sheer volume of it was staggering, folder after folder organized by date, by location, a meticulous archive of voyeurism that went back years, capturing moments of privacy I had thought were mine alone. There were videos of me changing, videos of me sleeping, videos of my friends who had stayed over for sleepovers, all cataloged with a sick precision that turned my stomach. I wanted to look away. I wanted to run, but I forced myself to look, to witness the depth of his depravity, letting the horror fuel the fire that was burning away the last remnants of my hesitation. I found a USB drive in his drawer, plugged it in, and began the transfer. The progress bar moving agonizingly slow, each percentage point a step closer to freedom, a step closer to justice, while the files copied. I went to the kitchen, needing to do something, anything, to mask the sound of my own heart, to create a facade of normalcy for when the sun inevitably rose. I started pulling out flour, sugar, blueberries, the ingredients for his favorite pancakes, the domestic ritual becoming a cover for my espionage, as I whisked the batter, the rhythmic sound soothing my frayed nerves. I realized that I wasn't just making breakfast. I was preparing the final meal for the man who had died in my heart long ago. I wasn't Clara the victim anymore. I was Clara, the executioner, and the execution was set for dawn. The rhythmic sound of the metal whisk hitting the ceramic bowl became a hypnotic metronome, measuring out the seconds of the dying night. while my mind drifted back to the exact moment the Marcus we loved died and the monster was born. It wasn't a sudden explosion of violence, but a slow, creeping rot that started 3 years ago, right after my mother's first cancer scare. When the medical bills began to pile up on the kitchen counter like snowdrifts in a blizzard, we were drowning in the uniquely American nightmare of healthcare debt, terrified of losing the house. And that was when Marcus stepped in, not just as a husband, but as a financier, paying off the debt with a flourish of his pen that felt less like generosity and more like a purchase. I remember the look in his eyes as he handed the check to the hospital administrator, a look of cold calculation. The look of a man who had just bought a very expensive racehorse and expected it to win every single race. He came home that night and sat us down, his voice dripping with faux concern, and explained that things would have to change, that we needed to be more disciplined, effectively turning our gratitude into a leash that he would tug on for the rest of our lives. That was the day the laughter in our house died, replaced by a hushed reverence for the man who saved us, a debt he made sure we never, ever forgot. The control started with the small things, insidious and easy to overlook, disguised as care or logical financial planning, like a vine slowly strangling a tree. He convinced my mother to quit her job at the library, arguing that she was too fragile to work, that he wanted to pamper her, but in reality, he was cutting her lifeline to the outside world, making her financially dependent on him for every single cent. I watched as my mother, once a woman who loved bright red lipstick and loud laughter, began to fade into the beige walls of the house, wearing the pastel, modest clothes he picked out for her, asking for an allowance like a child asking for candy. He monitored the odometer on her car, questioning every extra mile, isolating her from her friends until her entire universe shrank down to the size of his approval. He used money as a weapon, rewarding good behavior with gifts and punishing disobedience with cold silence and withheld funds, training us like dogs to seek his favor. I was in high school then, watching this erosion of her spirit, hating him for it, yet feeling paralyzed because how do you fight a man who puts a roof over your head and pays for your mother's chemotherapy? The guilt was a heavy stone in my stomach, the feeling that we owed him our lives, and he played on that guilt like a virtuoso, reminding us daily of the sacrifices he made for his girls. Then came the shift in his attention toward me, a subtle darkening of the atmosphere that felt like the drop in pressure before a tornado touches down. It started when I turned 16, the age where a girl stops being a child in the eyes of the world, and apparently, in the eyes of her stepfather. He became obsessed with my purity, policing my hemlines, checking my phone messages, lurking in the hallway when I had friends over, his presence a dark cloud that sucked the air out of the room. I remember the first time his mask slipped completely, the first time I saw the violence simmering just beneath his polished veneer. I was texting a boy from my chemistry class, smiling at a joke, when Marcus snatched the phone from my hand, his face twisted into a snarl of jealous rage that didn't belong to a father. He didn't hit me, not then, but he smashed the phone against the granite countertop, the plastic shattering with a sound like a gunshot, staring at me with eyes that were black holes of possession. "I pay for that phone," he had whispered, his voice trembling with suppressed fury. "I pay for everything, Clara, which means I own everything, including who you talk to." He replaced the phone the next day with a newer model, acting as if nothing had happened, gaslighting me into believing I had provoked him, that I was the ungrateful child pushing a saint to his breaking point. Standing in the kitchen, watching the blueberries sink into the thick batter, I realized with a jolt of nausea that my silence had been his greatest accomplice. I had stayed silent when he insulted my mother's intelligence, telling myself it was just his stress talking, staying silent when he walked in on me in the bathroom, telling myself it was an accident. We had normalized the abnormal, excusing his behavior because he didn't hit us with his fists, unaware that he was beating us black and blue with his words and his wallet. I looked around the kitchen, seeing it now for what it was, not a home, but a stage he had built for his own ego, where we were just props to be moved around at his will. The expensive appliances, the marble floors, the high-end security system, they were all bars of a golden cage, and he held the only key. But he had made a fatal miscalculation. He assumed that because we were dependent, we were weak, that because we were grateful, we were blind. He didn't understand that gratitude can curdle into resentment, and that a cornered animal, no matter how small, will eventually bite back. The batter was ready. The oven was preheating, and the sun was just beginning to bleed into the sky, painting the world in shades of violent red and orange. I wasn't just cooking breakfast. I was preparing the final scene of his play, but this time I had rewritten the ending. I moved to the dining room to set the table, my movements precise and ceremonial, treating the placement of every fork and knife as a tactical decision in a war he didn't know had begun. I laid out the placemats, the expensive linen napkins he insisted on, creating a tableau of perfect domesticity that would serve as the backdrop for his downfall. I thought about the files on the USB drive currently burning a hole in my pocket, the gigabytes of proof that would strip him of his reputation, his career, and his freedom. He had spent years building this image of the perfect family man, the pillar of the community, polishing it until it shone, never realizing that the brighter the light, the darker the shadow it casts. I placed his coffee cup at the head of the table, the spot where he sat like a king, and felt a surge of dark, cold satisfaction knowing that this was the last time he would ever sit there. The smell of baking muffins began to fill the air, a sweet, comforting scent that masked the toxic reality of our lives, a perfect metaphor for our entire existence under his roof. I heard the floorboards creak upstairs, the heavy, distinct footsteps of Marcus waking up, the sound that used to trigger a Pavlovian response of fear in my gut. But today, the fear was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp focus, the kind of clarity a soldier feels right before the first shot is fired. I returned to the stove, flipped the burner on, and watched the blue flame dance, whispering to the empty room. "Come down, Marcus. Your breakfast is ready." The digital clock on my nightstand flickered to 10:14 p.m., the red numbers glowing like demonic eyes in the semi-darkness of my bedroom, marking the exact minute my life as a naive girl ended and my life as a survivor began. I was sitting on the edge of my bed, pretending to study for my art history final, my eyes scanning the pages of a textbook without actually seeing the words, because my ears were strained, tuned to the frequency of the house like a sonar dish. Outside, the wind howled through the old oak trees, scratching the branches against the siding like skeletal fingers trying to get in. But the real danger wasn't outside in the storm. It was pacing in the hallway just a few feet away. I heard the floorboards groan, that specific, high-pitched creak that only happened when someone heavy stepped near the linen closet. And my stomach twisted into a cold, hard knot of dread. I gripped the highlighter so hard that the yellow ink bled through the thin paper, staining the image of a Renaissance Madonna, a cruel irony that I would appreciate only later. The doorknob turned slowly, the brass mechanism clicking with a deliberate, agonizing slowness that was designed to terrify, to remind me that locks in this house were just suggestions, not barriers. I didn't say, "Come in." I didn't have to. Because Marcus never asked for permission, he only demanded submission, and as the door swung open, the hallway light spilled in, cutting across the room like a searchlight finding an escaped prisoner. He stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the light, holding a glass of amber liquid that swirled as he leaned casually against the frame, his posture relaxed, almost bored. which was infinitely more terrifying than if he had been angry. He wasn't wearing his suit jacket, just a white dress shirt with the top button undone, exposing the hollow of his throat, and the sleeves rolled up to reveal his forearms, the same arms that used to push me on the tire swing. "Still studying, Clara?" he asked, his voice smooth and low, a rich baritone that had charmed bank tellers and charity boards alike. But to me, it sounded like the hiss of a gas leak filling a closed room. "You push yourself too hard. Perfection is a heavy burden to carry alone," he said, stepping into the room. Invading the sanctuary I had tried so hard to keep pure. The air in the room seemed to change, growing heavy and thick with the scent of his expensive cologne, a mix of sandalwood and musk that made my throat close up in a reflex of disgust. I pulled my knees up to my chest, creating a small, pathetic fortress of limbs, and tried to keep my voice steady as I answered. "I have a big exam tomorrow. Marcus, I really need to focus." He chuckled, a dry sound devoid of humor, and walked over to my desk, running a finger along the spine of my sketch pad, claiming ownership of my space with every casual touch. "Focus is good," he murmured, picking up a framed photo of me and my mom from a trip to the beach. "But you need to focus on the right things, the things that truly matter in this world." He set the photo down, face down, a symbolic gesture that sent a chill racing down my spine, and then he pulled the tablet from under his arm, the screen coming to life with a harsh, blue glow that illuminated his face from below. "I've been thinking about your future, Clara, about how expensive art school is, about your mother's medical treatments," he said, walking towards the bed, his steps slow and predatory, forcing me to shrink back against the headboard. "I do so much for this family. I carry the weight of the world on my shoulders. And sometimes, I wonder if you truly appreciate the lifestyle I provide." I opened my mouth to recite the script of gratitude he had trained me to say, to thank him for the roof and the food, but he held up a hand to stop me, a sharp, commanding gesture. "Don't," he whispered. Sitting down on the edge of my mattress, his weight dipping the bed, pulling me slightly towards him against my will. "Words are cheap, Clara. I prefer action. I prefer visual proof." He turned the tablet around, and the world stopped spinning. The air left my lungs, and my heart hammered a frantic rhythm of sheer terror against my ribs. On the screen, in high-definition clarity, was a video of me, taken from a high angle, standing in my bathroom, drying my hair after a shower, completely unaware, completely vulnerable. The camera must have been hidden in the ventilation fan, a black eye staring down at my nakedness, stealing the one thing I thought I still owned: my own body. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" he asked, his voice taking on a reverence that made me want to vomit, his eyes glued to the screen, watching the digital version of me while the real me sat frozen in horror just inches away. "The way the light hits your skin, the innocence of it, it's pure art. Clara, better than anything in those dusty textbooks of yours." I tried to look away, to shut my eyes, but I couldn't. I was paralyzed by the shock of the violation, by the realization that for months, maybe years, he had been watching. "Why?" I croaked, the word tearing out of my throat, raw and broken. "Why are you doing this?" He looked up from the screen, his eyes locking onto mine, and for the first time, I saw the true depth of his sickness, a dark, swirling void of narcissism and depravity. "Because I can," he said simply, a shrug in his voice. "Because I own this house. I own the cameras, and by extension, I own everything they capture." And he swiped the screen, showing another video, this one of me sleeping, the infrared camera turning my skin a ghostly white, capturing the rise and fall of my chest. "You have no idea how much people would pay for this," he mused. "Men who appreciate youth and beauty, men who are bored with the fake, plastic women they see in magazines." The threat hung in the air, unsaid but screaming. a blade pressed against the throat of my future. "Please," I whispered, the tears finally spilling over, hot and stinging on my cheeks. "Please delete it. Marcus, I'll do anything. Just please don't show anyone." It was exactly what he wanted to hear. The surrender, the begging, and a cruel smile curled the corners of his lips as he leaned closer, invading my personal space until I could feel the heat radiating from his body. "Anything," he repeated, savoring the word, rolling it around on his tongue like a drop of fine wine. "That's a very dangerous promise to make, Clara." He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind my ear, his fingers lingering on my cheek, his skin dry and callous, a touch that felt like a brand. "I don't want money. I have plenty of that," he whispered, his breath smelling of scotch and mint. "I want a private performance, a live show, just for me, and maybe a few select friends on a secure stream." My stomach heaved, the bile rising in my throat, the room spinning as the reality of his demand crashed down on me. He wasn't just a peeping Tom, he was trafficking me, selling my image, selling my dignity to satisfy his own twisted power trip. "Tomorrow night," he said, his voice hardening, losing the faux warmth, becoming the voice of the businessman closing a deal. "When your mother is asleep, or pretending to sleep, you will leave your door unlocked, and you will do exactly what I tell you." "And if I don't?" I asked, a spark of defiance flaring up in the ashes of my fear, a desperate, dangerous question. He laughed, a low, rumbling sound that vibrated through the mattress, and stood up, towering over me, casting a long, dark shadow that seemed to swallow the room. "Then, my dear, you become a star," he said, tapping the tablet screen with a manicured fingernail. "I'll upload everything, the showers, the changing, the sleeping, to sites where it can never be deleted, where it will live forever." He walked towards the door, pausing with his hand on the knob, turning back to look at me one last time, his face a mask of triumphant evil. "Think about your mother, Clara. Think about the shame, the scandal. Think about how it would kill her to see her little girl exposed like that." It was the ultimate leverage, the nuclear option, and he knew it. He knew I would burn myself to the ground to keep a single spark of pain from touching my mother. "Tomorrow night," he repeated, "wear something accessible." The door clicked shut, the sound final and absolute, sealing me in with the echoing silence of the room and the suffocating weight of his ultimatum. I didn't move for a long time. I couldn't move. My body locked in a state of shock, my mind racing through a maze of impossible choices. I looked at the spot on the bed where he had sat, the fabric still depressed, and felt a wave of revulsion so strong it made me shake uncontrollably. He thought he had won. He thought he had checkmated me with shame and fear, pinning me down under the thumb of his control. He thought I was the same scared little girl who cried when she scraped her knee, the girl who needed him to fix everything. But as the minutes ticked by, turning into hours, the fear began to curdle, thickening into a cold, hard rage that settled in the pit of my stomach like a stone. I wiped the tears from my face with the back of my hand, a rough, aggressive motion, and stood up, my legs trembling but holding my weight. I walked to the bathroom, to the very spot where he had filmed me, and looked directly into the vent fan, staring down the invisible lens. "No," I whispered to the empty room. "No more." I wasn't going to be his victim. I wasn't going to be his star. I was going to be his end. I blinked, and the suffocating darkness of my bedroom memory vanished, replaced instantly by the sterile, stainless steel reality of the kitchen, where the only sound was the low, electric hum of the refrigerator and the frantic beating of my own heart against my ribs. I looked down at my hands, half expecting to see them trembling or stained with the shame of last night, but they were steady, holding the whisk with a grip that felt like iron, a physical manifestation of the cold resolve that had crystallized in my chest. The sun was just beginning to bleed over the horizon, painting the sky in bruises of purple and red. A violent dawn for a violent day. And I knew I had less than an hour before the master of the house descended from his throne. I walked to the sink and splashed freezing cold water on my face, gasping as the shock hit my skin, washing away the phantom sensation of his breath on my neck, washing away the victim he thought he had created. I looked at my reflection in the darkened window, seeing not a scared stepdaughter, but a strategist in the final moments before a coup. And I reached into my pocket, my fingers curling around the USB drive. It was warm against my palm, a tiny piece of plastic that held the weight of my freedom, and I knew that once I made the next move, there would be no turning back, no safety net, only the hard concrete of truth. I wasn't running away, I wasn't hiding, I was burning the bridge behind me so that the only way forward was through him. The first call had to be the one that sealed his fate legally, the one that turned his private collection into a federal indictment. So I pulled out the burner phone I had kept hidden in a box of old winter coats for 2 years. I dialed the number for the cybercrimes unit, a number I had memorized during long nights of research, my thumb hovering over the call button for a split second, a final hesitation before I ignited the fuse. "This is it," I whispered to the empty room, the words acting as a binding contract with myself, and I pressed the button. Listening to the hollow ringing that sounded like the tolling of a distant bell, a voice answered, professional and clipped. "Cyber tip line, Agent Miller speaking." And I forced my voice to be calm, to be the voice of a credible witness rather than a hysterical girl. "My name is Clara Thorne," I said, reciting the script I had rehearsed in my head 1,000 times. "I am sending you an email right now containing evidence of non-consensual surveillance, possession of illicit material involving unconscious subjects, and intent to distribute." I hit send on my laptop simultaneously, watching the progress bar shoot across the screen like a silver bullet, carrying the gigabytes of his depravity directly to the authorities. "I am in the house with the suspect," I continued, cutting off the agent's questions. "He is dangerous, he has threatened blackmail, and I need a unit here within 45 minutes. Silent approach." The agent on the other line shifted instantly from intake mode to tactical mode, his voice sharpening, promising that a team was already rolling. And as I hung up, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders, replaced by the terrifying lightness of adrenaline. The second call was the one that made my stomach churn with a different kind of nausea. The call that would shatter the heart of the only person I truly loved. But it was necessary to ensure she was there to see the mask fall. I dialed my mother's cell, praying she was awake at her sister's house 2 towns over, praying she would answer on the first ring so I wouldn't lose my nerve. "Clara." Her voice was groggy, laced with sleep and immediate worry. "Honey, is everything okay? It's 5 in the morning." I took a deep breath, channeling the best acting performance of my life, injecting a tremor into my voice that wasn't entirely fake. "Mom, you need to come home, right now," I said, pitching my voice low and urgent. "It's not me, I found something of Dad's. Something in the attic that Marcus tried to throw away, and you need to see it before he wakes up." It was a cruel lie, using my dead father as bait, but I knew it was the only hook strong enough to drag her out of bed and into the car without her calling Marcus first. "I'm on my way," she said, the sleep vanishing instantly, replaced by protective instinct. "I'll be there in 30 minutes. Clara, don't let him touch anything." I ended the call and leaned against the counter, closing my eyes for a moment to forgive myself for the pain I was about to cause her, knowing that the temporary pain of the truth was better than the terminal cancer of living a lie. She had to be here. She had to see the police take him away, or she would never truly believe that her knight in shining armor was actually the dragon. The third action wasn't a call to a person, but a digital handshake with the house itself, a subversion of the very technology Marcus used to control us, turning his fortress into a sieve. I picked up the iPad that controlled the smart home system, the screen glowing with the layout of the property, every door and window marked with a green locked icon. Marcus had set the perimeter alarm to stay mode, meaning any breach from the outside would trigger a siren loud enough to wake the dead, giving him time to destroy evidence or hurt me before the police could breach the heavy oak doors. I entered the master override code, a sequence I had watched him punch in 100 times from the reflection in the hallway mirror, and watched as the icons turned from green to amber. System disarmed. The notification flashed, a silent victory that meant the police could glide up the driveway and walk through the front door without a sound. I went a step further, disabling the cameras in the kitchen and the hallway, blinding him in his own command center, ensuring that when he came downstairs, he would be walking into a black hole of information. It was a symbolic reclaiming of my space, a digital exorcism of his presence before the physical one could take place. I placed the iPad back in its charging dock, wiping my fingerprints from the screen with the hem of my shirt, leaving no trace of my sabotage. The house was no longer his weapon, it was my trap, and the jaws were wide open, waiting for him to step inside. With the calls made and the trap set, the frantic energy that had driven me through the night began to settle into a cold, eerie calm, a state of hyper-focus where every detail seemed magnified. I looked around the kitchen, seeing the dust motes dancing in the shafts of morning light, hearing the distant chirp of a cardinal, feeling the cool granite of the countertop under my fingertips. I wasn't afraid anymore. The fear had burned itself out, leaving behind only a hollow space that I filled with determination and a dark, simmering anticipation for the confrontation to come. I walked over to the stove and turned on the burner, the blue flame blossoming like a flower of pure heat, and placed the griddle over it, the metal groaning as it expanded. I poured the batter onto the hot surface, the hiss of the cooking pancakes sounding like a whisper of judgment, and watched as the bubbles rose to the surface and popped, one by one. I was going to cook him the best breakfast he had ever had. I was going to serve him coffee in his favorite mug, and I was going to smile as I watched his world disintegrate. I checked the clock on the microwave, 6:15 a.m. The police were 10 minutes out. My mother was 5 minutes out. Marcus would be waking up any second. The stage was set. The actors were in place, and the curtain was about to rise on the final act of his tyranny. I smoothed my hair, straightened my spine, and waited for the sound of his footsteps, ready to play the role of the dutiful daughter one last time. By 6:30 a.m., the kitchen smelled like a lie, a sickeningly sweet concoction of vanilla extract and sizzling butter that masked the metallic tang of fear still lingering on my tongue. I had scrubbed every surface until the granite countertops gleamed like obsidian mirrors, wiping away not just the flour dust, but the invisible fingerprints of the trauma that had suffocated this house for years. The stack of blueberry pancakes sat on the center of the table, a golden tower of carbohydrates and compliance, steaming gently in the morning light that filtered through the blinds I had precisely angled. It was a masterpiece of domestic performance art, a breakfast fit for a king. Or, in this case, a breakfast fit for a man who believed he was a god in his own private kingdom. I arranged the silverware with the precision of a surgeon laying out instruments, the knife blade facing inward, the napkin folded into a sharp, geometric triangle. Every detail calculated to feed his delusion of absolute control. The silence in the room was heavy, not with peace, but with the held breath of a predator lying in wait, watching the trap door, waiting for the unsuspecting foot to fall. I slipped into the downstairs powder room, avoiding the mirror for a moment, needing to compose the mask I would wear for the final act of this tragedy. I stripped off the oversized hoodie that had been my shield during the long night, and pulled on the dress I had stashed there earlier, a high-collared navy blue piece I had worn to my high school graduation. It was conservative, almost severe, buttoning all the way to my chin, covering every inch of skin he had violated with his eyes, a physical barrier between his perversion and my soul. I cinched the belt tight around my waist, feeling it grip me like a second rib cage, holding me upright, forcing my posture into a rigid line of defiance disguised as poise. I splashed cold water on my wrists, cooling the blood that pulsed there, and finally looked at my reflection, searching for the girl who used to cry in this bathroom. She was gone, replaced by a woman with eyes like flint, a woman who had turned her terror into a weapon, a woman who was ready to look the devil in the eye and smile. The sound of heavy footsteps on the stairs above signaled his descent, a rhythmic thudding that used to make my stomach clench in Pavlovian terror. But today, it sounded like the drumbeat of a funeral march. Marcus entered the kitchen, bringing with him the scent of expensive aftershave and the arrogant energy of a man who sleeps the sleep of the remorseless. His suit jacket slung casually over one shoulder. He stopped in the doorway, his eyes sweeping over the pristine kitchen, landing on the steaming breakfast, and a slow, satisfied smile spread across his face. A smile that made my skin crawl. "Well, well," he said, his voice thick with self-congratulation. "I see someone has decided to be sensible, to embrace her role in this family." He didn't see the trap, he only saw the tribute, interpreting my labor as submission, my silence as consent, his narcissism blinding him to the reality that the prey had become the hunter. He walked to the head of the table, the master of the house taking his rightful place, and I pulled out his chair, a gesture of servitude that was actually the final locking of the cage door. He sat down, shaking out the linen napkin with a flourish, and picked up his knife and fork, slicing into the stack of pancakes with a surgical precision that reminded me of how he had dissected our lives. "This is excellent, Clara," he said through a mouthful of food, chewing slowly, savoring the sweetness, completely unaware that he was eating the last meal of a free man. "I knew you would come around. You're a smart girl. You know which side your bread is buttered on, and frankly, tonight is going to be very lucrative for us." He gestured with his fork, pointing at me, the silver tines gleaming in the sunlight, while he outlined his plans for the evening's broadcast, as if he were discussing a stock merger. "I've already sent out the invites to the VIP list," he boasted, wiping a smear of syrup from his lip. "Gentlemen who appreciate freshness. They are paying a premium, so I expect you to be accommodating, to be enthusiastic." He laughed then, a low, wet sound. Believing he had broken me, believing he owned me, never hearing the sirens that were silently approaching, never seeing the sword hanging by a thread directly above his neck. The silence that followed Marcus's grotesque business pitch was not broken by my submission, but by the slow, creaking sound of the pantry door opening behind him, a sound that made the fine hairs on the back of his neck stand up as the atmosphere in the room shifted from smug control to suffocating dread. My mother stepped out from the shadows where she had been standing for the last 10 minutes, her face a mask of absolute devastation, clutching the iPad so tightly that her knuckles were white, her eyes red and swollen but fixed on the man she had married with a look of pure, unadulterated horror. Marcus froze, his fork hovering halfway to his mouth, a piece of blueberry pancake trembling on the tines. As the color drained from his face faster than water from a broken dam, leaving him gray and aged in the span of a single heartbeat. "Elena," he choked out, the name sounding foreign in his throat, his arrogant demeanor shattering instantly into the desperate, scrambling panic of a rat caught in a trap. He started to stand, his chair scraping violently against the marble floor, his hands raising in a placating gesture. "Honey, wait, I can explain. It's just a misunderstanding. A bad joke," he stammered, trying to weave the web of gaslighting that had worked so many times before. But my mother didn't speak. She just pressed the play button on the screen, and his own voice, recorded just seconds ago, filled the kitchen, boasting about freshness and premium prices, a digital echo that cut through his lies like a guillotine blade. The realization hit him then, a physical blow that made him stagger back against the table, overturning the juice pitcher, the orange liquid spreading across the white tablecloth like a stain of toxic guilt. Before he could formulate another lie, the front doorbell rang, a cheerful melodic chime that echoed through the house, sounding absurdly bright against the darkness of the moment, signaling the arrival of the end. Marcus's head snapped toward the hallway, his eyes wide and frantic, the predator suddenly realizing he was surrounded, his breathing coming in short, shallow gasps. "Don't answer that," he hissed at me, his voice dropping to a menacing growl, pointing a shaking finger at my face. "Clara, you stay right there. You tell them to go away. Tell them we're sick." I looked at him, really looked at him, and realized that the monster was gone, replaced by a pathetic, small man in an expensive suit. A man who had no power over me anymore. I didn't say a word. I didn't even nod. I simply turned my back on him, a gesture of supreme disrespect that hit him harder than a slap, and began to walk toward the front door. "Clara," he screamed, the sound raw and desperate. "If you open that door, I swear to God, you will regret it for the rest of your life." But his threats were just noise now, fading into the background like static on a radio, drowned out by the steady, rhythmic clicking of my heels on the hardwood floor. I reached the heavy oak door, my hand closing around the brass handle, the metal cool and solid, and I pulled it open, breaking the seal of his fortress, inviting the consequences in. Standing on the porch was not a neighbor or a delivery man, but a phalanx of blue windbreakers, a team of federal agents whose grim expressions told me that they had seen the files, that they knew exactly what lived inside this house. "Ms. Thorne," the lead agent asked, his voice low and urgent, his hand resting near the holster at his hip. "We have a warrant." I stepped aside, pressing my back against the wall, and watched as they flowed into the hallway like a tide of justice, efficient, silent, and unstoppable, their boots thudding against the floor with the weight of the law. They swept into the kitchen, guns drawn but pointed low, a swarm of authority that filled the space, turning Marcus's private kingdom into a crime scene in the blink of an eye. Marcus was backed against the refrigerator, his hands trembling violently, his eyes darting between the agents and my mother, looking for an escape route that didn't exist. "What is the meaning of this?" he shouted, trying to summon the bluster of the respected community leader. "I am Marcus Thorne. I demand to speak to my lawyer. You can't just barge into my home." Agent Miller stepped forward, holding up a piece of paper. "Marcus Thorne, you are under arrest for the possession and distribution of child pornography, illicit surveillance, and human trafficking." The words hung in the air, heavy and absolute, stripping away his titles, his reputation, and his mask, leaving him naked in his crimes. He slumped, the fight leaving his body as the reality of his situation crashed down on him. But then his eyes found me, standing in the doorway with my arms crossed, watching him with the cold detachment of a judge. "You," he spat, his face twisting into a snarl of pure hatred. "You ungrateful little snake. I gave you everything. I made you who you are." He lunged forward, a desperate, final attempt to hurt me, to regain some shred of control, but two agents were on him instantly, slamming him against the counter, the impact rattling the china in the cabinets. I didn't flinch. I didn't step back. I just raised my hand and pointed a steady finger toward the study, toward the hidden world he thought was safe. "The server is behind the bookcase in the west wall," I said, my voice clear and unwavering, cutting through the chaos of the arrest. "The encryption key is his birthday, and the backup drive is right there, next to his pancakes." Marcus stared at me, his cheek pressed against the cold granite, his eyes wide with the shock of betrayal, realizing that the quiet, obedient girl he had tormented had been meticulously plotting his destruction right under his nose. I met his gaze, holding it until the cuffs clicked shut around his wrists. And in that moment, the power dynamic shifted forever. The king was in chains, and the girl was finally, truly free. I walked closer to where he was pinned against the kitchen island, the cold granite pressing harshly into his flushed cheek, and looked down at the man who had loomed so large in my nightmares for 5 long years. He wasn't a giant anymore. He wasn't the master of the house. He was just a sweating, panting creature in a wrinkled suit, his eyes darting wildly like a trapped animal, stripped of the dignity he valued more than human life. "Do you remember the girl who cried when her goldfish died?" I asked softly, my voice cutting through the heavy, tension-filled air of the kitchen. "The girl who trusted you to hold the back of her bike seat so she wouldn't fall. That girl died the night you decided her privacy was a commodity to be sold, murdered by the very hand that was supposed to protect her from the cruelty of the world. You didn't just break a law, Marcus. You broke a soul, chipping away at my humanity piece by piece until you thought there was nothing left inside me but fear and obedience. But you forgot one thing about survivors, about the people you try to bury in silence. We grow roots in the dark, and we learn how to shatter the concrete to reach the sun." I reached out and picked up the untouched coffee mug from the table, pouring the contents slowly into the sink, a symbolic gesture of draining his influence from our lives, watching the dark liquid swirl away, just like his power. Agent Miller pressed a hand to his earpiece, listening to a confirmation from the tactical team currently dismantling the false wall in the study. His expression hardening into stone as the true scope of the depravity became clear. He looked at Marcus with a disgust that transcended professional detachment, pulling a clear plastic bag from his pocket that contained the USB drive I had planted on the table, the digital smoking gun that would bury him forever. "Marcus Thorne," he recited, the words sounding like a hymn of retribution in the morning light. "You have the right to remain silent, though I suggest you start saving your breath for the federal judge who signs your sentence." He listed the charges, a litany of filth that filled the pristine room: manufacturing child pornography, wire fraud, extortion, racketeering, each count a nail in the coffin of his social standing. The handcuffs clicked tighter, the metal biting into his wrists, a physical manifestation of the consequences he thought he was too smart, too rich, and too powerful to ever face in this lifetime. He tried to squirm, to speak over the agent's voice, but the weight of the law was heavy on his back, pressing the air out of his lungs and the arrogance out of his soul. The kitchen, once his domain of control, had transformed into the holding cell of his reality, the stainless steel appliances reflecting his downfall in high definition. I turned my gaze to my mother, who was standing by the pantry door, her body trembling as if she were standing in a blizzard, tears streaming down her face in silent rivulets of grief and shock. This wasn't an act of vengeance, born from the hot, chaotic fire of hatred, but a surgical removal of a malignant tumor that was killing us both slowly, day by agonizing day. "I didn't do this to hurt you, Mom," I said, walking over to her and taking her cold, limp hands in mine. "I did this so you wouldn't wake up one day and realize you had spent your life sleeping next to a monster." Justice isn't always loud. It isn't always a scene from an action movie. Sometimes it is just the quiet, painful decision to turn on the lights and reveal the ugly truth hiding in the corners. I wanted to save the house, the money, the reputation, but I realized that the price of those things was your soul and my sanity, a price that was far too high to pay. We are homeless now, maybe broke, and certainly damaged, but we are clean, we are free, and we are no longer the supporting characters in his sick, twisted play. I squeezed her hands, feeling a faint squeeze back, a signal that beneath the trauma, the mother who raised me was still there, waking up from a long-induced coma. Marcus twisted his neck, straining against the agent's grip to catch my mother's eye, desperate to play the only card he had left. The card of emotional manipulation he had used for a decade. "Elena, please," he begged, his voice cracking. "She's lying. She's mentally unstable. You know how she gets. Don't let them take your husband away. Think about everything I've done for you." For a second, the old fear flickered in her eyes, the conditioned response to his voice. But then she looked at the iPad she was still clutching, the digital proof of his betrayal burning in her hands. She took a deep breath, her spine straightening as she shed the skin of the victim, and looked him dead in the eye with a gaze that was colder than the grave. "My husband died 5 years ago," she whispered, her voice trembling but resolute. "You are just the thief who has been wearing his clothes, spending his money, and abusing his daughter." She turned her back on him, a final, irrevocable rejection, and buried her face in my shoulder, choosing the daughter who saved her over the man who enslaved her. It was the moment his power truly evaporated, not when the cuffs went on, but when the audience he performed for finally walked out of the theater. The agents hoisted him to his feet, hauling him toward the door like a sack of garbage, his expensive Italian leather shoes dragging uselessly across the hardwood floor he had been so proud of. We followed them out onto the porch, shielding our eyes against the bright, mocking sunshine of a perfect suburban morning, watching the final act of his downfall play out on the manicured front lawn. The neighbors had gathered, drawn by the lights and the commotion, standing in their robes and slippers, witnessing the pillar of the community being dragged out in irons like a common criminal. He tried to hide his face, to shrink away from the judgment of the people he had tried so hard to impress. But there was nowhere to hide, no shadow deep enough to cover his shame. As they shoved him into the back of the unmarked sedan, he looked back one last time, his eyes meeting mine through the tinted glass. And I didn't look away. I didn't blink. I watched until the car turned the corner and disappeared, taking the darkness with it, leaving us standing in the ruins of our life, breathing the first lungful of air that truly belonged to us. The silence that settled over the street wasn't the silence of oppression anymore. It was the blank page of a new story, terrifying and beautiful, waiting to be written. The last police cruiser turned the corner at the end of the block, its red and blue lights finally extinguishing, leaving a sudden, ringing silence that felt heavier than the siren's wail. The neighbors, those suburban spectators in their bathrobes and slippers, who had watched the spectacle with coffee mugs in hand, began to retreat into their homes, the show over, leaving us alone on the porch of a house that was no longer a home. My knees, which had been locked in a stance of defiance for hours, finally gave way, not from weakness but from the sheer, crushing weight of the adrenaline leaving my body. And I sank onto the cold concrete steps. My mother collapsed beside me, pulling me into her arms with a desperation that bordered on violence, burying her face in my neck, her tears hot and wet against my skin, soaking the collar of the dress I despised. We didn't speak, because there were no words that could bridge the gap between the horror of the past and the uncertainty of the future. So we just sat there, rocking back and forth like survivors of a shipwreck washed ashore. I listened to her sob, a raw, guttural sound of grief for the years lost and the trust broken, and I held her tighter, becoming the parent she needed in that moment, stroking her hair and whispering that it was over, that the monster was in a cage, and that the keys were at the bottom of the ocean. The sun continued to rise, indifferent to our pain, bathing the manicured lawn in a golden light that felt almost insulting in its cheerfulness, highlighting the irony that the darkest day of our lives was happening on such a beautiful morning. We eventually stood up, our limbs stiff and heavy, and turned to face the front door, the gaping maw of the beast we had just slain, realizing with a shudder that we had to go back inside to retrieve what was left of ourselves. The house felt different now, stripped of its grandeur, the air inside stale and smelling of the forensic dust the agents had left behind, the silence no longer threatening, but hollow, like the inside of a tomb. We walked through the hallway, stepping over the muddy boot prints left by the police, ignoring the gaping holes in the drywall where the hidden cameras had been ripped out like malignant tumors, leaving behind ugly scars of wire and insulation. I didn't feel fear anymore, only a profound sense of disgust. A feeling that the very walls had been complicit in his crimes, absorbing our secrets and broadcasting them to his sick world. We moved through the rooms like ghosts, avoiding the furniture he had chosen, avoiding the art he had bought, gravitating only toward the things that were truly ours, the small, insignificant items that predated his reign. I went to my room, the scene of so many silent screams, and grabbed a black trash bag from the kitchen, feeling a sudden, violent need to purge, to cleanse my space of his influence before I packed a single box. It wasn't just about moving out, it was about exorcising him from the physical world, erasing his fingerprints from the fabric of my life so that when I walked out the door, I wouldn't carry a single ounce of him with me. I opened my closet door and began to pull down the clothes he had bought for me, the dresses that were too short, the blouses that were too sheer, the expensive fabrics that felt like costumes for a play I never wanted to audition for. I didn't fold them. I didn't donate them. I shoved them into the black plastic bag with a ferocity that surprised me, treating silk and cashmere like toxic waste that needed to be contained. I threw in the digital photo frame, the tablet, the jewelry he had given me as apology gifts after his rages, listening to the satisfying crunch of plastic and glass as they hit the bottom of the bag. My mother joined me, dragging her own bags from the master bedroom. Her eyes dry now, but hard as flint, tossing in her wedding album. The expensive coats, the symbols of her status as the wife of a successful man. We filled bag after bag, piling them in the center of the room. A mounting pile of garbage that represented a fortune in dollars but a deficit in morality. It was a ritual of destruction, a necessary burning of the fields so that something new could grow in the ashes. And with every item I discarded, I felt a little lighter, a little more like the Clara I used to be. We stripped the beds, leaving the mattresses bare. We emptied the drawers, leaving them gaping open like hungry mouths, dismantling the stage set until the room looked as empty and broken as we felt. But in that emptiness, there was potential. Later that afternoon, we sat on the floor of the living room, surrounded by a small fortress of cardboard boxes containing only books, old photos, and the few clothes we had bought with our own money. The movers were coming in the morning, not to take us to another mansion, but to a small, two-bedroom apartment on the other side of town, a place with thin walls and no security system, but a place that we would pay for ourselves. My mother reached across a box and took my hand, her grip firm, looking at me with a clarity I hadn't seen in her eyes since my father died. "I'm sorry," she said, the words simple but heavy with the weight of her negligence. "I saw the signs, Clara. I saw the way he looked at you, the way he controlled the money. But I was so afraid of being poor again, so afraid of being alone, that I let myself go blind." I looked at her, seeing the lines of worry etched into her face, and I realized that she had been a prisoner too, trapped in a cage of her own making, seduced by the security he offered until she couldn't see the bars. "I know, Mom," I whispered, squeezing her hand back, forgiving her not because she was blameless, but because carrying the anger would only tether me to him forever. "We don't have money anymore," she continued, a small, rueful smile touching her lips. "We have debt, we have a lawsuit, and we have a long road ahead." "We have freedom," I corrected her, feeling the truth of the word settle in my chest, warm and solid. "And I'd rather eat ramen in a free apartment than steak in a prison." The next morning, the house was completely empty, a hollow shell of drywall and marble that echoed with our footsteps as we did the final walkthrough, checking for anything left behind. I walked into the kitchen one last time, looking at the spot where Marcus had been arrested, expecting to feel a phantom pang of fear. But there was nothing, just a sunbeam hitting the dusty floor. I left the keys on the counter, a final act of relinquishing the lease on a life that didn't fit, and walked out the front door without looking back, leaving the ghosts to haunt each other in the dark. We loaded the last box into the rental truck, the physical labor feeling good, grounding me in the reality of our new beginning, a beginning built on sweat and honesty rather than lies and manipulation. The air outside smelled of cut grass and gasoline, a mundane, suburban scent that suddenly felt intoxicatingly sweet, the scent of a world that was wide open and waiting for us. I climbed into the passenger seat, watching my mother start the engine, her hands steady on the wheel of the cheap rental truck, looking more powerful in her t-shirt and jeans than she ever had in her designer gowns. We were leaving the stepfather behind, leaving the victim behind, driving toward a horizon that was no longer blocked by his shadow. Before we pulled away, I asked my mother to wait a second, rolling down the window and reaching into my bag to pull out the only thing of value I had saved, my father's old Nikon camera. I stepped out onto the curb, the heavy metal cool in my hands, and looked up, not at the house, not at the neighborhood, but straight up into the endless, sprawling blue of the sky. I raised the viewfinder to my eye, the mechanical click of the focus ring sounding like a heartbeat, framing a shot that had no walls, no ceiling, no cameras, just infinite, terrifying, beautiful space. I remembered Marcus's obsession with capturing me, with trapping me in his lens. And I smiled, realizing that he had never really seen me. Not the way this camera saw the world. I wasn't a subject to be owned. I was the photographer. The one with the eye. The one with the control. The one who decided what was worth keeping and what was worth deleting. I pressed the shutter, the loud clack echoing in the quiet street like a gunshot starting a race, capturing the light, the clouds, the sheer possibility of the future. I lowered the camera, took a deep breath of the free air, and climbed back into the truck. "Ready?" my mother asked, putting the truck in gear. "Ready," I said. And as we drove away, I didn't look in the rearview mirror once,